In the depths of the Great Depression, with the Dust Bowl ravaging the land, one family faced a brutal winter that threatened to swallow them whole. As black blizzards ravaged the plains, they relied on a hidden refuge, a secret tunnel system buried beneath their feet that would become their only chance at survival. Before we step into their story, tell us where you're watching from, and if the fight for survival in the face of nature's wrath moves you, be sure to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's tale might just outlast this one. The winter of 1935 began early in the heart of the Dust Bowl, a cruel omen for the families who had already suffered through years of relentless drought and ruinous storms. The skies, once a pale blue, had long been choked by swirling, suffocating clouds of dust that never seemed to lift. For the Martins family, each day had become a struggle not just to survive, but to find a way to live with the certainty of loss that hung in the air like the dust itself. But on this particular morning, the wind carried a heavier weight than it ever had before. Martha Martins sat by the small kitchen window, looking out over the parched land. The fields, once fertile with crops, were now nothing but a barren sea of dirt and dead plants. Her husband, Daniel, had spent weeks reinforcing the cabin, trying to make it more than just a shelter. They had to prepare for the worst, for this winter was promised to be unlike anything they had faced before. The first storm came without warning. A chill wind from the north swept through the land, bringing a thick layer of dust that blotted out the sun. It wasn't just the usual dust storm, the kind that made the air thick and yellow, but something much worse. This storm was different. It was colder, more brutal. The wind howled like a living creature, clawing at the wooden cabin with a fury that felt personal. Inside, the family huddled together. Martha wrapped herself and her young daughter, Lucy, in layers of worn blankets. Her husband, Daniel, stood by the door, his hand on the lantern as he watched the storm rage outside. His face was drawn and weary, but there was a spark in his eyes that couldn't be extinguished. He wouldn't give in. Not yet. "We've got to prepare, Martha," Daniel said, his voice tight with worry. "The worst is coming." She nodded, knowing that what he meant was not just the storm outside, but the creeping dread that had settled into their bones over the last few years. The land, the government, the banks, they all seemed to be against them. Every day brought new worries, new hardships, and for some families, new deaths. But Daniel had a secret, a plan that no one else knew about, a tunnel system built beneath the cabin, carved out in the darkest of nights when the dust was too thick to breathe outside. It wasn't much. A few feet beneath the surface of the earth, it would never withstand the full force of a blizzard. But in times like these, every scrap of ingenuity was worth 1,000 prayers. The tunnel had begun as a small idea in Daniel's mind, a thought planted after too many sleepless nights spent listening to the howling wind outside. The dust storm seemed endless, but it wasn't the storm that worried him the most. It was the suffocating fear that came with it, the fear that one day the blizzards would become so fierce that they would be unable to escape. Their cabin, small and exposed, would not stand against the storm. It had to be more than just walls. It needed a lifeline. It was an old technique used by settlers in the past. When the blizzards became too fierce, when the wind howled so violently it ripped through walls and doors, families had dug tunnels to survive. They'd carved out small subterranean spaces beneath their homes where they could find shelter places to hide, to breathe, to wait out the storm. It was a desperate measure, but one born of necessity. So Daniel began his work. Each night, after the sun had set and the dust had settled, he would slip outside, shovel in hand. The ground was hard, frozen, and unforgiving. But Daniel's determination was stronger. He didn't care about the cold or the dust that burned his skin when he worked. He had one goal in mind: survival. Little by little, he dug. A small hole at first, just big enough to crawl into. Then, as the days turned into weeks, the tunnel began to grow. A few feet here, a few feet there. It wasn't much, just a small escape route beneath the cabin, but it was enough. Martha didn't ask questions at first. She could see the worry in Daniel's eyes, the way he'd disappear for hours each evening, only to return covered in dirt and dust, his hands cracked and swollen. But when the cold of the first blizzard gripped their home, she saw the truth of it. The tunnel wasn't just an idea, it was their last hope. She wasn't sure if it would be enough. How could it? No one could have predicted the kind of storm that was coming, the black blizzards that would block out the sky and freeze the very air. But it was a chance, and in the unforgiving world of the Dust Bowl, a chance was worth more than anything else. That night, as the storm howled outside, Daniel opened the trap door that led to their makeshift tunnel. He placed the lantern at the entrance, the flickering light casting long shadows on the dirt walls. "Come, Martha, it's time." The storm hit in earnest that night, the wind shrieking like a wild animal caught in the desert. Martha, clutching Lucy to her chest, looked toward Daniel, who stood by the trapdoor, his lantern casting a faint glow in the otherwise pitch-black cabin. The wind had already begun to rattle the windows, the sand scratching against the wood with a maddening persistence. The sky outside had turned the color of death, and with each passing minute, the blizzard's fury grew. "Down there," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. "We have to go. It's the only way." Martha hesitated for just a moment, looking around the small cabin one last time. This place, this humble shelter, had been their home, their refuge from the storms. But now, it was nothing more than a fragile shell, a temporary fortress against nature's wrath. If the wind and dust tore through their cabin tonight, they would have nowhere to turn. There was no more time for doubt. The tunnel was their salvation. Daniel climbed down first, his footsteps muffled in the sand-packed passageway, followed closely by Martha, who carefully placed Lucy into the crook of her arm and descended after him. The cold hit them almost immediately, but it was different from the cold of the blizzard above. This was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, the kind that felt both eternal and empty. Yet, in that stark quiet of the tunnel, the howling winds above seemed like distant echoes, a faraway threat. The tunnel stretched deeper beneath the earth than Martha had realized. It was narrow, barely wide enough for the two of them to move side by side. The walls, dug hastily with only the dim light of lanterns, were rough and uneven, yet sturdy enough to hold the weight of the earth above them. As Daniel led the way, Martha could feel the weight of the ground pressing down on her shoulders, an uncomfortable reminder of the danger that still hovered over their heads. "How long do you think it will last?" she asked, her voice tight with worry as she followed him down. Daniel didn't answer immediately. His face was grim, lit only by the flickering light of the lantern as he turned to face her. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken fear that had grown since they first felt the storm's warning in the air earlier that week. "I don't know," he said at last. "But it doesn't matter now. All we can do is wait and hope." As they moved further into the tunnel, Martha felt an odd sense of relief. The cabin above them was far away now, sealed behind layers of earth and dust. They were hidden, safe for the time being. But as she tightened her grip on Lucy, her thoughts returned to their neighbors, to the other families who hadn't prepared, who didn't have a plan like theirs. She wondered how many would survive this storm, how many would make it through this unforgiving winter. The wind continued to howl above, but now it felt muffled. The earth pressed in around them, and for a moment Martha could almost convince herself that she was at peace. But that peace was fleeting, for deep down she knew this tunnel, this desperate measure, might be the only thing that stood between them and death. Time slowed to a crawl in the depths of the tunnel. The storm above them raged without mercy, the sound of the wind and dust colliding with their underground sanctuary growing louder, like a living thing, desperate to break through. The lantern flickered softly, casting long shadows on the rough walls. Martha sat on the floor, her arms wrapped around Lucy, who had long since fallen asleep, her tiny body warm against her mother's chest. Daniel sat nearby, his back against the cool earth, his face drawn in concentration. His eyes were fixed on the entrance of the tunnel, even though they couldn't see anything through the thick layers of dirt and sand above. Every so often, he would glance at Martha, as if checking to make sure they were still safe, still together. "We'll get through this," he murmured, almost as if speaking to himself. But there was something in his voice that wasn't certain, a quiet fear that Martha recognized all too well. This wasn't just a storm, it was something worse. The winds outside had already buried their cabin once, and it had only taken one blizzard to make them realize just how fragile their lives really were. The storm's intensity began to build. The pressure in the air grew heavier, almost suffocating, as if the very earth above was pushing down on them. Martha felt it in her chest, the tightness that came with each breath. The cold that had seemed distant at first now crept into her bones. The sawdust-packed walls of the tunnel helped a little, but it wasn't enough to keep out the brutal chill of the world outside. "We have enough food," Daniel said after a long silence, his voice low and steady, though there was a faint tremor in it. "We'll make it. We just need to wait it out." Martha nodded, though she wasn't sure how much longer they could hold on. The food they'd packed was sparse, and they hadn't prepared for more than a few days' worth of survival underground. The wind had already claimed their cabin. What would happen when their supplies ran out? The thought gnawed at her. "How much longer, Daniel?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her, his eyes searching her face. There was nothing to say. She knew what he was thinking. They were at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. The storm could last days, it could last weeks. There was no way to know. The air in the tunnel grew thicker as the hours passed, the weight of the storm pressing on them from above. Every now and then, a tremor would shake the earth, a small reminder that they were still living on the edge, still trapped beneath the dust and wind. But even as the storm outside threatened to tear the world apart, Daniel and Martha clung to the small flame of hope that had guided them this far. It was in that shared silence, the kind of quiet that only comes in the darkest hours of survival, that Martha understood something fundamental. Survival wasn't just about making it through the storm. It was about living with it, enduring the suffocating uncertainty, and finding a way to survive, no matter how impossible it seemed. The storm had begun, but it wasn't over yet. The worst was still to come. When the blizzard finally began to quiet, it did so with an eerie, unsettling calm. The roar of the wind, which had seemed relentless for days, had softened into a low, distant whisper. The tunnel, once a refuge, now felt strangely still, as if the world above had paused, waiting for something, waiting for them to make it through. Martha held Lucy close, the child's small body warm against her chest. Daniel was silent beside them, staring at the small opening where the earth had been carefully dug away. His face was drawn, exhausted, but his eyes were filled with a quiet determination that Martha had come to trust. "We've made it," Daniel whispered, though it almost felt like a question. He sat on the cold ground, running a hand through his unkempt hair. His mind seemed to race with the knowledge that this storm wasn't over. But for now, they were alive. They had survived. Martha didn't answer. She didn't need to. The tunnel was holding, but there was a deep, quiet ache in the air. The storm had taken everything. Their cabin, their fields, their neighbors, it was all gone. The land they had fought for, the dreams they had built in the dry, unyielding earth, were now as buried as the cabin under layers of dust and snow. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The weight of the silence was oppressive. For a moment, she thought of the others, the families who hadn't built tunnels, who hadn't prepared. The thought made her throat tighten. Daniel stood, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. He looked at the trapdoor, leading back up to the surface, then back to Martha. "We'll rebuild," he said, though his voice faltered slightly. He hadn't said that before, not in the way he did now. The certainty was gone, replaced by the sobering reality of what had been lost. Martha nodded, her hand brushing Lucy's hair. They were still here, still breathing. The world outside might be in ruins, but for now, this tunnel, their secret refuge, was a small victory. And for the first time since the storm began, Martha allowed herself a fragile hope. They weren't beaten yet, the worst had passed. And now, they could begin to rebuild,